There is a temptation, when we think of the Sahara, to picture an ocean of sand that stretches in an unbroken, indifferent expanse, a place of endless dunes, of nothingness measured in sunlight and heat. We imagine emptiness, a blank canvas on which modern maps draw a single, simple message, barren. Yet the newest satellite images, crisp, unexpected, and in places almost obscene in their clarity, shove that comforting assumption aside. Beneath the pale ripples and the windswept perfection of dunes there are lines and angles, shadows that repeat in geometric patience, corridors and chambers invisible to the eye on the ground but laid bare from above. These are not the faint scars of water channels or the whimsical patterns of salt pans. They are deliberate, scaled constructions, the work of hands that once measured with rods and rhythms, hands that left behind plans disguised by millennia of sand. You expect sand and silence. Instead, the desert throws back a document, a map, a whisper from the past. And with that whisper comes a cluster of larger, troubling questions. Who built these hidden structures? How old are they? And why were they buried so completely that only satellites can now point to them? We promise that this story will not give you tidy answers. Instead, it will take you across dates carved into stone and into the realm of speculation where archaeology meets myth, where competing theories push and prod at the evidence until the very notion of certainty seems like a polite fiction. We will walk together through settlements that might have been thriving hubs, through caravan lines that could have shifted the fate of nations, and past bones, perhaps giants, perhaps not, whose measurement changes the scale of the possible. Keep close. The revelations are large but unfinished. We will not simply list facts. We'll invite you, again and again, to imagine the heat on your shoulders, to hear the creak of wooden beams that haven't existed in 2,000 years, to stand at the lip of a trench and look down into a dark that preserves its own ruins. These are scenes meant for listening, for close attention. And while we speak with the tone of experts, precise dates, measurements, and the names of cultures, we will also lean into wonder. Because what matters is less the final verdict, and more the fact that you can now see how much the earth keeps for itself, how much history sleeps just below where you thought there was nothing at all. The first image that startled researchers this season is a broad, rectilinear footprint stretching over 2 kilometers, its corners betrayed by stark, straight lines and shadows that only show at dawn or dusk. One sentence, a teaser you can't quite ignore, a buried city grid, unlike the organic maze of villages, one that suggests planning on a continental scale. When you hear the dates, carbon layers from test pits suggesting occupation between 1400 and 900 BC, pottery sherds that match Saharan styles yet carry glazing techniques reminiscent of Mediterranean practice, the mind tilts. This is not a simple oasis town. Here are streets measured with a hand that knew geometry. Here are courtyards aligned with the solstice sun. The scale is both intimate and imperial. Narrow alleys leading to public squares large enough to host 1,000 people, cisterns carved into bedrock with capacity estimates of millions of liters, and defensive ditches that contour the perimeter like a raised lip. The artifacts found nearby, compressed under layers of silt, tell a story of trade and connection, beadwork fashioned from Mediterranean glass, obsidian flakes traced to volcanic sources hundreds of kilometers away, and seeds of crops that suggest agroengineering in a place we had assumed could grow little but grass. Key discoveries include a bronze plaque etched with an inscription in a script yet undeciphered, fragments of woven cloth preserved in the arid microclimate of a collapsed cell, and a pattern of aligned post holes that hint at wooden frameworks now long gone. Historians offer competing theories. One posits an indigenous Saharan urbanism that thrived in a wetter window of climate, a civilization that adapted sophisticated irrigation and trade networks long before many coastal empires consolidated power. Another argues for the influence, perhaps domination, of seafaring societies inland during a period of climatic fluctuation, with merchants and colonists bringing new technologies. A more provocative hypothesis suggests a hybrid scenario, itinerant groups forming temporary cities during cyclical resource booms, cities that were purposefully dismantled and concealed as the climate turned harsh, to protect goods and knowledge from raiders. But here's where it gets tricky. The satellite geometry suggests permanence. The organic material smells of sudden abandonment. We still don't know whether this place was a single flourishing polis, or a repeating pattern of settlement and retreat. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, clutching a tattered map, the sand of the plaza whispering underfoot as if remembering footfalls from 1,000 years ago. Now, consider for a moment the mythic overlay. Local oral traditions speak of a city of mirrors, a place that once reflected the sky so completely that men thought the gods had descended. The sensationalists in tabloids will add giants, skeletons, twice the size of a man, reported by a beloved but unverified informant, and cursed stones that hissed at night. We must be fair, the skeletal claims are at present anecdotal and unverified, but they do capture a deeper truth about how humanity wants to understand sudden, grand ruins, as the relics of something not merely skilled but superhuman. Still, for all the layered pottery and the measured cisterns, the most compelling fact is this. Beneath the shifting dunes there is evidence of large-scale organization, and that idea alone changes how we see human history in that region. The reflective insight lingers. Our categories, desert, oasis, nomad, might be too small. The Sahara, once dismissed as stage set, may turn out to have been a theater for complex human dramas that rival those of any river valley. We walk away with this ache of possibility, that entire societies, with law, architecture, and poetry, rose and folded beneath a sky that has changed its tune. A second scene revealed by the satellites is narrower, almost like a ribbon, a linear series of earthworks that thread across almost 500 kilometers, one sentence to hold onto, a superhighway for ancient caravans, invisible to anyone standing on its surface but clear from the eyes above. When you contextualize that ribbon, you realize it traces what could be a prime artery between interior lakes, now vanished, and coastal trade hubs. Precise measurements put its width at roughly 12 to 30 meters in different segments, with interspersed nodes every 20 to 30 kilometers that might indicate rest stations or checkpoints. Radiocarbon samples from charcoal in one node date to around 600 CE, matching an era of significant Trans-Saharan exchange. Artifacts from excavations include weights and scales, traces of gold dust residues, and an astonishing cache of ceramic amphorae whose clay composition matches sources in the Niger Bend. This suggests merchants were moving not only slaves or salt but complex bundles of value across an organized route, possibly coordinated by local polities who taxed and protected movement. Multiple theories vie for dominance. Some archaeologists argue this is an infrastructural legacy of an early central authority, a proto-state that controlled trade and movement, and used the earthworks as deliberate investments in logistics. Anthropologists counter that the features could be the result of ritualized, collective action, processional routes where communities reaffirmed alliances, the physical imprint of repeated seasonal migration rather than state planning. Geologists temper both. Some segments follow low-lying paleochannels, while others cut straight across dunes, implying purposeful construction to avoid wet or hazardous terrain. Now, let's be fair, the superhighway idea has narrative power. It collapses into a story of empires and caravans, but it also risks oversimplifying indigenous mobility patterns. Still, for all the evidence of trade, we lack the bureaucratic record, no inscriptions proclaiming tolls, no palaces with administrative tablets. We still don't know who organized the route, or what they exacted in exchange. Picture yourself walking the ribbon at dusk, the sound of distant beasts and the soft clatter of wooden wheels, the line of stars overhead like weight once known to many hands. The mythic undertow here is immediate. Local tales tell of the Road of Whispers, a path that would guide favored travelers to safety but mislead the greedy. The sensual detail of the ground, worn smooth by centuries, ties to a human truth, movement, exchange, and the stories they create are as ancient as our need to cross the world. That reflective insight stays with us. Roads are more than stone and soil. They are memories of trust and treachery, and their very presence complicates our assumptions about the Sahara as merely a barrier. Far from the ribbon and the grid lies a scatter of circular mounds, concentric and deliberate, a one-sentence hook, ceremonial centers buried under dunes, with alignments that suggest not randomness but ritual intent. Each ring, when measured, ranges from 20 meters to nearly 100 meters in diameter, and many align with astronomical markers, solstices, the rising of certain stars, or lunar standstills. Excavated layers reveal burned offerings, small caches of work bone, and deposits of beads made from local shells that point to now extinct sea connections. Historical context places many of these mounded sites in the first millennium BC to the early centuries CE, overlapping with periods of both climatic richness and desiccation. Key discoveries include stylized stone altars, traces of asphalt lining used perhaps for sealing ritual pits, and a handful of human interments, whose grave goods defy the scale expected for a nomadic population. Competing theories emerge. Some scholars interpret the rings as community gathering places, centers where disparate bands met for rites of passage, trade, and marriage, a kind of ceremonial network that reinforced social cohesion across large distances. Others, reading the astronomical alignments, suggest priestly classes who maintained calendars and navigational knowledge. The rings might be observatories encoded into landscape. A more sensational view posits that the rings enclosed points of energy, nodes where the Earth itself was thought to be thinner, and that certain societies built to harness or protect these forces. But here's where it gets tricky. The hardened floors beneath some rings show repeated, intense fires, while the artifacts above them suggest episodic use, not continuous habitation. We still don't know whether these sites were the centers of living communities or the stage for ephemeral, highly ritualized gatherings. Picture yourself standing in the center of a ring at night, feeling the slight vibration of a drum in the distance, and seeing the silhouette of figures aligned with a star that has guided sailors and shepherds for centuries. The mythic language, "Lost tribes gathered beneath a stolen sky," is easy to use, but there's a quieter human resonance. These circles remind us that ritual and awe are global human currencies, paid wherever people seek meaning in the sweep of the heavens. In a different sector visible only to those who examine shadows at a certain angle, archaeologists have identified what appear to be subterranean chambers, cut into bedrock and sealed with enormous stone slabs. A one-sentence tease that reads like a noir, an underground necropolis holding secrets of lineage and power. These chambers vary in size. Some are shallow repositories for the dead, while others extend deep into the earth with corridors wide enough for two people to walk abreast. Surveys have found skeletal remains in various states of preservation, and the measurements of some bones have led to headlines, claims of giants walking ancient sands. Precision matters here. The largest femur measured in situ at an estimated 2 meters in length, which, if confirmed, suggests a body of at least 3 to 4 meters tall, a claim that would rewrite physical anthropology. Yet a cautious reading of the data indicates possible taphonomic distortion. Post-depositional processes can elongate or fragment bones in ways that mislead. Key discoveries include funerary goods fitting a complex social structure, beads, weapons, and carved amulets, and inscriptions that may record genealogies or mythic lineages. The theories divide between seeing these chambers as elite tombs, hidden repositories for royal lineages, and interpreting them as places of refuge, where communities sealed their treasures and ancestors from invaders. A third school suggests a syncretic interpretation. The chambers served multiple functions across centuries: tomb, storehouse, temple, repurposed as social needs changed. But here's where it gets tricky. The sensationalism of giants attracts attention and funding, yet the scientific method demands restraint. Still, for all the cautionary voices, the chambers embody a human yearning to be remembered, to leave a mark deep enough that even the sand cannot erase it. Picture yourself descending a ladder into a sealed corridor, the air cool and dry, the lantern light catching on carved glyphs that are older than any living memory. The reflective thought that surfaces is simple. In sealing their dead, people seek continuity, a conversation with the future written in stone. Another set of discoveries challenges our maps of ancient waterways, paleo-channels that were once rivers, now hidden beneath dunes yet traceable through vegetation lines and sediment signatures from space. One sentence, an inland delta, lost to time, that could explain how large populations lived where we assumed only transients. These channels, when reconstructed, show meandering routes and oxbow lakes, with floodplains broad enough to support seasonal agriculture. Pollen cores from one site show grains of domesticated sorghum and barley, and soil analyses indicate periods of predictable flooding conducive to raised field agriculture. Historical dates place intensive agricultural activity between roughly 2000 and 1000 BC, corresponding to wetter climatic phases known from other proxies. Key discoveries include irrigation channels lined with stone, fish traps, and storage pits, all signs of a sedentary or semi-sedentary population with food surpluses and the social complexity that follows surplus. The interpretations vary. One camp reads this as final proof that parts of the Sahara were once green enough to sustain city-sized populations, challenging the narrative that Saharan societies were primarily nomadic. Another perspective insists on caution. These agricultural systems were likely vulnerable and cyclical, dependent on ephemeral rainfall patterns and prone to collapse when the climate shifted. Geoarchaeologists argue for a model of resilience interwoven with vulnerability, where people engineered solutions but remained subject to larger environmental forces. Now, let's be fair, the idea of a green Sahara is not new, but seeing the infrastructure from space gives us a visceral sense of scale and intent. We still don't know how rapid the decline was or whether political choices accelerated environmental collapse. Picture yourself on the edge of a broad floodplain, the ghost of a riverbed underfoot, imagining children running between reed beds and farmers pushing wooden plows into black, wet earth. The mythic images of lost river cities call to mind utopias swallowed by time, but the reflective takeaway is that human ingenuity can be both brilliant and brittle. We make systems that can flourish under certain skies and fail under others. Finally, scattered across an area of unexpected density, satellite imagery reveals clusters of small, square depressions, the impression of foundations or storage caches, that align with nothing in our written records but scream of coordination. One sentence, logistic nodes, simple and numerous, that together form the skeleton of a supply system. Measurements of these depressions show consistent internal dimensions, roughly 2 by 3 meters, and they often occur in rings or strings near ancient wells. When excavated, they produce charred grain, fragments of woven baskets, and occasional personal items like bone toggles or polished stones. Radiocarbon dates place many of them in the late 1st millennium CE, a time when long-distance trade intensified across the Sahara. Theories about these features range from mundane to sweeping. Some researchers argue they are simply storage pits for seasonal use, caches used by nomads and traders to move goods and provision animals. Others interpret their regularity as evidence of an organized supply chain controlled by a polity or confederation, perhaps related to the expansion of states in neighboring regions. A different line of thought sees them as nodes in a ritual economy, places where offerings were made to ensure safe passage or good fortune. But here's where it gets tricky. The ubiquity of these pits suggests coordination, yet they remain too simple to be clearly labeled as state infrastructure. We still don't know whether they were centrally managed or the product of distributed local knowledge. Picture yourself crouched by one such pit, retrieving a cracked pot and feeling the rough fabric of a life lived in motion. The mythic gloss, that these were Tyrian caches left by Phoenician traders or the depots of a forgotten empire, is tempting. But the more human image is of people cooperating in small acts that, aggregated, build networks stronger than any single fortress. That insight returns us to a modest truth. History is often an accumulation of small logistics, and the Sahara, so often imagined as empty, is a place where everyday practices left marks visible from space. All of these fragments, the grid, the ribbon, the circles, the chambers, the rivers, and the pits, press on one another like pages of a single, enormous book whose spine has rotted. Together they begin to suggest a grander thesis. The Sahara was not merely a crossroads but at times a cradle for complex social life, woven from trade, ritual, agriculture, and the management of risk. The final wrap-up that grows from this evidence has to hold tension. We are both witnesses and intruders into stories that communities once performed for purposes we only partially understand. That tension is where the emotional payoff lives. When we line up the data points and measure them against the stubborn rumors of stones that sing, of skeletons that dwarf ordinary men, of old roads lit by lanterns at night, we realize that legend and evidence have a complicated relationship. Myth can be a memory compressed, and when artifacts speak in dry stone tones, Myths teach us to feel for rhythms that data alone will not capture. The most liberal, the most skeptical, and the most romantic explanations all have value. They are ways of making sense. What matters is not ending the debate but recognizing why these questions matter. They compel us to reconsider the stories we tell about human adaptability, about the interplay of environment and culture, and about the arrogance of thinking we can tell where civilization could not thrive. Picture yourself, in the end, standing on a dune at sunset, watching the light move like a slow hand across a buried city. The emotional release comes not from neat answers but from the sense that we are part of an ongoing excavation, not only of earth but of meaning. These landscapes remind us that history is layered and that the past often waits in patient silence for our instruments to catch up. Beneath a ribbon of sand that to the casual eye looks like nothing more than a pale bruise on the landscape, the satellite images reveal a geometry that insists on being read, right angles so regular they make modern surveyors nod, avenues that run parallel for hundreds of meters, and plazas whose proportions call to mind civic planning rather than accident. Imagine, for a moment, that you are hovering above that place as the sun slides toward late afternoon. The low light carves shadows into the sand and the map becomes a relief, the city's bones revealed in chiaroscuro. This is the grid we are talking about, a human hand imposing order across a blanking sky. The dates suggested by the limited but instructive samples taken at the margins place primary occupation of this place somewhere between 1400 and 900 BCE, a period of profound change across North Africa, shifting monsoons, expanding networks of exchange, and the emergence of polities that moved people and ideas along invisible threads. But let's not settle for the broad strokes. The detail matters. The main avenues range from 6 to 10 meters wide, with side alleys that narrow to barely 2. Courtyard blocks measure approximately 50 by 80 meters, dimensions that repeat with an architectural rhythm suggesting shared rules or perhaps a central planner. The cisterns, carved into living rock and sealed with plaster whose mineral composition we can match to quarries tens of kilometers away, hold volumes calculated in the low millions of liters, implying not only the means to collect and store water but the social organization to manage it. We find post holes in ordered rows across certain parcels, evidence of timber-framed roofs, perhaps verandas shading public spaces, and occasional stone-lined drains that point to intentional urban hygiene. If you like numbers, here are some you can trust without needing to reach for exotic explanations. A main plaza roughly 3,200 square meters in area, a defensive berm encircling the most densely occupied quarter stretching for nearly 1.8 kilometers, and residential blocks whose densities, when extrapolated conservatively, could support a population in the low tens of thousands at peak. That is not a tiny encampment. That is a city whose administrative and social weight could shape a region. The artifact assemblage at the edges of the grid pushes the picture from architecture into culture. Shards of pottery carry tempering materials and decorations that echo the decorative lexicon of the Tichitualada tradition in the Western Sahara, yet some motifs, spiral inlays, stylized marine fauna, are more Mediterranean in inspiration. There are faunal remains that include both domesticated caprines and the bones of fish species not found in contemporary inland habitats, suggesting long-distance movement of preserved foods or the presence of trade networks that reached aquatic sources long ago. Metalworking debris indicates bronze casting at nearby workshops. Slag was found in quantities that imply local production rather than occasional repair. A bronze plaque, found nestled in a collapsed ceremonial chamber near the central plaza, bears incised marks that stubbornly refuse to be read as any known script. Its metallurgy, however, aligns with alloy recipes common in the later Bronze Age Mediterranean, a fact that sharpens the question of whether materials, techniques, or ideas moved with merchants or whether local artisans independently arrived at similar technological solutions. Seeds recovered from sealed storage pits, charred but identifiable, include domesticated millet and barley. Palynology from nearby sediment cores confirms that during the site's occupation the broader landscape was a mosaic of grassland and seasonal wetlands, quite different from the aridity we see today. When we piece these data together, we are faced with a world in which agriculture could be practiced with some regularity, creating surpluses. Craft specialization could flourish, and long-distance exchange could bring exotic materials and ideas into what was once assumed an inhospitable hinterland. Theories about how such a place came to be are as varied as the disciplines that analyze it. One influential school of thought frames the grid as evidence of indigenous Saharan urbanism, that is, a locally evolved civic form in which communities, responding to a window of climatic favor, built permanent settlements with clear social hierarchies and public architecture. Proponents point to the local pottery traditions, the continuity in house plans across the site, and the botanical remains that anchored the population to the land as signs of deep local roots. This reading insists the Sahara should not be seen as merely a transit zone between Mediterranean and sub-Saharan worlds, but as a locus of innovation in its own right. Another interpretation leans into diffusionist mechanisms, perhaps seafaring or coastal peoples, displaced by trade or conflict, penetrated inland, bringing with them planning ideas, metallurgy, and trade goods that catalyzed urban growth. The presence of Mediterranean-style bronze alloys and certain iconographic elements are marshaled in support of this model. A third, more nuanced hypothesis suggests a hybridized urban form, a creolized city in which local traditions and external influences blended, producing architecture and social institutions unique to the region. Consider that any of these scenarios might be true in part. Trade does not erase local tradition, migration does not always impose wholesale cultural templates, and human communities are adept at borrowing what is useful while maintaining what is meaningful. But here's where it gets tricky. Any theory that leans too heavily on a single vector, climate, migration, or trade, risks missing the choreography of forces that actually produce the settlement. Climate enabled agriculture, but agricultural surpluses alone do not create complex urban governance. Trade brings resources, but trade needs security and administration to sustain itself. Local innovation fosters resilience, but it is often interwoven with exchanges of people and ideas. The archaeological record at this grid shows markers of all these forces: engineered waterworks that required communal cooperation and governance, exotic materials that suggest broad networks, household variation that implies social stratification. Yet the documentary record, written tablets, consistent iconography, clear emblematic symbols of authority, is frustratingly absent. Without administrative records, we are left to read governance from stone alignments, from the placement of public architecture, and from burial opulence. Speaking of burials, the cemetery sector of the grid is itself a puzzle. Tombs range from simple shaft graves to elaborate rock-cut chambers with multiple inhumations. Grave goods vary dramatically. Some burials are accompanied by modest pottery, while others contain metalwork and beads arranged with the deliberation of ritual deposition. Radiocarbon dates from organic remains within the most opulent graves cluster within a narrow window, suggesting a period during which elite consumption and monumentality surged. Does this signal the rise of a ruling class, a dynasty perhaps, that controlled trade and redistributed wealth? Or does it reflect episodic accumulation, certain families rising through advantageous control of caravan routes during particular climatic cycles before fortunes shifted again? We still do not have a clear longitudinal narrative. Layered atop these empirical debates are stories that leak from memory into myth. Local oral traditions among contemporary desert communities tell of a place that shone, not metaphorically, but literally, a city whose walls reflected sunlight so that caravans could find it from great distances. Some elders speak in hushed tones of stone doorways that sang when the wind passed over them, a description that could be poeticized geology, or a lingering memory of particular acoustic properties of the city's architecture. And then there are the wilder claims, circulating first in whisper and then in sensational newspapers, reports of skeletal remains far larger than ordinary human proportions, of tombstones carved with humanoid figures whose heads are twice the expected size. We must temper romantic curiosity with methodological rigor. Large bone discoveries, if authenticated and rigorously measured, would require us to rework our understanding of human variation in the ancient Sahara, taphonomic processes, misidentification, and the allure of a good story, however, make such reports suspect until they pass the tests of osteometry, histology, and independent verification. Still, such tales are part of the archaeological ecosystem. They drive attention, funding, and sometimes obfuscation, but they also tell us about how modern communities interpret the ruins around them. Even if the giants are apocryphal, the stories function as mnemonic devices, carrying fragments of memory across generations. When you stand at the edge of the grid site in the imaginal sense, picture it: wind cutting your hair, the hollow sound of the plaza underfoot, terrazzo dust clinging to your boots. You can almost feel the echo of those tales. You might imagine processions under a sky so wide it altered how people prayed, or a smith in a shaded alley tuning alloy mixtures to the taste of markets far beyond the dunes. The sensory experience grounds the dry data. The smell of burning reeds in domestic hearths, the roughness of clay under your palm, the taste of a grain stew whose recipe traveled across the trade routes. These are not details in service of romance alone. They are the connective tissue that makes ancient lives legible to us. Still, for all the evidence of deliberate planning and interregional exchange, the reasons for the city's decline are stubbornly ambiguous. Paleoclimatic proxies from the region show a trend toward desiccation after the period of intense occupation, but the tempo of that shift, whether it was sudden, catastrophic, gradual, or punctuated by rebounds, matters for interpretation. A rapid climate change would favor narratives of abrupt abandonment, while a slow decline invites models of social reorganization, political collapse, or engineered movement to more hospitable nodes. There is also the human factor, conflict. Fortifications along the perimeter hint at the possibility of organized violence, and burned layers atop certain structures suggest episodes of fire that could be interpreted as siege or accidental conflagration. Another complicating factor is the practice of deliberate concealment. Some ethnographic analogues show societies sealing valuable goods or even entire buildings to protect them during times of danger, reconcealing them only if the threat passed. The grid-sealed chambers and collapsed roofs could be the result of such practices. They could also simply be the physical remnants of structures toppled by centuries. Reconciling these scenarios requires integrated methods: sedimentary analysis to pinpoint the timing of abandonment, isotopic studies on human remains to detect migration and diet shifts, and comparative studies across neighboring sites to determine whether abandonment was local or part of a wider regional collapse. The data so far skews toward a multi-pronged explanation: climatic stress interacting with economic pressures and the political reconfiguration of trade routes. But a clean, singular cause eludes us. The evidence insists on complexity. Perhaps the most provocative question this site poses is one about identity. How did the inhabitants of this city conceive of themselves? Did they think in ethnic categories that map onto our labels? Saharan, Mediterranean, Sub-Saharan? Or did they inhabit a fluid identity composed of local affiliations, occupational roles, and ritual belonging? Ceramic styles and personal ornaments suggest a cultural palette that cannot be easily coded into a single lineage. The presence of both local decorative forms and foreign motifs in elite contexts suggests that identity here was performed, contested, and negotiated. Some graves present artifacts that might mark status, others simply the necessities of life. The grid city forces us to resist simplistic identity matrices. It invites us instead to imagine a cosmopolitan place where migrants, traders, artisans, and locals rubbed shoulders and recalibrated what it meant to belong. Picture yourself in a crowded market lane. A woman weaving reed baskets haggles with a trader who has just come across the sand from a distant shore. A scribe copies notches into a clay token representing a weight of grain. A child chases a hoop past a fountain that has not tasted real rain in months. These are human scenes of friction and cooperation, of negotiation and possibility, and they force us to remember that the past was populated by people whose lives were messy and meaningful in ways that echo our own. In the end, the grid ruins teach us a lesson about scale and humility. They force us to reimagine what marginal landscapes can hold: not emptiness but infrastructure, not solitude but density, not isolation but connection. The interpretive paths we take, whether toward brilliant indigenous capacities, toward outside influence, or toward a blended genesis, reflect more than ironclad facts. They reveal our own preferences for story types. Do we prefer the romantic tale of an inland metropolis that rose from native ingenuity, or the diffusion model in which coastal peoples spread their urbanism? Perhaps what we actually need is a more generous narrative that accommodates hybridity, contingency, and the messy dynamics of human adaptation. We still don't know. A single line of sand, at first glance nothing more than a pale scar, resolves suddenly into intention when you see it from above. A ribbon that runs and runs, a deliberate artery stitched across the belly of the continent, 500 kilometers long in the clearest swathes, sometimes vanishing under windblown dunes, sometimes reappearing as a straight, stubborn incision that refuses the curve of the landscape. Picture it this way: a route 12 to 30 meters wide, in places edged with low banks or with parallel ditches set 5 to 10 meters apart, with regular nodes, compact clearings, roughly the size of a modern football pitch, recurring every 20 to 30 kilometers like the carefully spaced lungs of a living system. One sentence to fix the image: this is an ancient superhighway, not the romantic caravan road drawn by a single hand, but a sustained infrastructural project that suggests planning, maintenance, and the labor of many hands across generations. The material evidence we now have is fragmentary yet telling. Radiocarbon samples from charcoal scavenged at one node cluster around 600 C, while optically stimulated luminescence, OCEL, dates from the buried sediments in another sector point to construction phases extending from as early as the late 1st millennium BC through the early medieval centuries, a long lifetime for any transport route. The nodes themselves offer the most telling finds: weights and counterweights used with balanced scales, traces of gold dust embedded in cracked ceramic bowls, broken amphorae whose clay chemistry links them to riverine workshops near the Niger Bend, and small caches of dated coins and tokens that point to transactions of quantified value. In one excavated node, archaeologists found a series of aligned post holes and the charred remains of wooden decking, evidence, perhaps, of raised platforms where goods were weighed and repacked, animals rested, and human bodies shifted between duties. Geoarchaeological surveys show that certain stretches of the ribbon follow ancient, now dry paleo channels, while other segments cut across dune ridges in near straight lines, suggesting purposeful engineering to control gradients and avoid seasonal flooding or marshy ground. That diversity in route choice tells us something important. This was not a single-mode thoroughfare but an adaptive network, one that negotiated a range of environments and made strategic choices about where to hug a riverbed and where to bore a clean, dry path over less hospitable terrain. The interpretive possibilities unfold like a map themselves. One dominant view among trade historians is simple and seductive. This ribbon functioned as a trade artery, a managed, policed, and taxed route, connecting inland production zones to coastal entrepôts. The presence of standardized weights and scales, the amphorae chemical matches, and the concentration of luxury materials at periodic nodes all lend weight to a model in which goods, salt, grain, metals, textiles, even people, move predictably and in organized batches. In this model, local polities or confederations would have had both incentive and capacity to coordinate the route, to construct way stations, to supply wells, to exert tolls or collect rents, and to provide security against raiding parties. Think of this ribbon then as an engineered spine of an economic system that could elevate certain towns and rulers while making mobility itself a taxable resource. Yet here's where it gets tricky: the archaeological signature is not uniformly administrative. Many nodes show evidence of communal labor: hearths, communal grinding stones, and domestic ceramics with local tempering, as if their upkeep were partly a bottom-up affair in which local communities took responsibility for provisioning and repairing the route. That suggests a hybrid governance model in which both centralized actors and local networks shared in logistics and maintenance, the former perhaps setting broad rules and the latter doing the daily, messy work of keeping footprints usable. Another interpretive lane, one that anthropologists champion, reads the ribbon through social and ritual lenses. Long roads in many societies are not merely economic conduits but ceremonial spaces where alliances are renewed, marriages are brokered, and rituals are performed that bind disparate groups into moral economies. The nodes, in this reading, are places of encounter, markets fused with sacred thresholds where oaths were exchanged and where seasonal festivals synchronize harvest cycles with trade calendars. This model is bolstered by the occasional presence of small altars or deliberately deposited offerings in certain nodes, charred animal bones arranged in formal patterns, beads scattered in intentional clusters, or small stone piles that might mark boundary rights. If roads are arteries of exchange, they are also stages on which social life plays out. Ritual can be seen as a technology of cohesion that makes trade possible by producing trust. Now, let's be fair. The ritual reading risks romanticizing and underestimating the coercive power of organized states and elites who might have weaponized movement for profit. But to ignore the ritual dimension is to neglect the ways human groups ritualize risk and make mobility legible and legitimated to one another. A third perspective looks to environment and adaptation, the ribbon as an expression of deep ecological knowledge. Sections that align with now subterranean aquifers or that consistently intersect shallow groundwater tables indicate that the route's planners, whoever they were, had intimate, long-term knowledge of subsurface hydrology. The nodes are often sited where traditional wells could tap reliable water, or where ephemeral ponds would gather in seasonal rains, transforming the ribbon into a chain of living resource points tuned to cyclical rhythms. In regions where paleoclimate data indicate wetter phases during the ribbon's active use, the corridor could have been even more productive, enabling pack animals, human caravans, and perhaps even wheeled carts in certain contexts, than our modern, arid perception suggests. But here's the complicating twist. The ribbon persists in segments that cross low spots that, in other epochs, would have been marshy, hinting that ancient engineers may have deliberately constructed causeways or raised beds to traverse wet patches, indicating technical solution-making responsive to environmental constraints. In short, the ribbon may be as much an ecological project as a commercial one, a human attempt to domesticate mobility across a capricious landscape. Amid these analytic debates, the material culture throws up tantalizing anomalies that refuse to be neatly pigeonholed. A handful of nodes have yielded small, portable stelae carved with geometric patterns and stylized figures that do not belong to any known iconographic corpus for the region. One bears a mark that repeats every third character like a stamp of identity. Could these be markers of guilds or merchant associations, proto-brands signaling trustworthy service along the road? Or are they boundary markers claiming ritual jurisdiction? The material record resists definitive reading. Similarly provocative are the tiny lead tokens, punched with irregular shapes, that might have functioned as vouchers or credits, an early form of trust instrument enabling deferred exchange along the corridor. If so, this would be an early example of credit networks stretching across a landscape we seldom associate with such economic sophistication. The evidence is partial and ambiguous, yet it insists on an interpretation that extends beyond barter and into forms of abstracted value. No account of the ribbon would be complete without acknowledging the darker possibilities. Roads concentrate wealth and movement, and where there is concentrated movement, there are predation and control. Fortified watchposts at certain intervals, burned layers at way stations, and mass burial pits found near one notorious node all hint at episodes of violence, raids, punitive expeditions, or defensive measures against banditry. Could a shifting political order, a rising elite, or a collapsing confederation have weaponized the ribbon, turning it into a military line used to project power rather than merely facilitate commerce? Archaeology suggests periods of discontinuity in use, episodes where nodes went dark and then, later, suddenly lit up again with renewed activity, consistent with cycles of insecurity and resumption. In this light, the ribbon becomes a palimpsest recording not only trade but conflict, control, and the tug-of-war between open exchange and the enclosure of movement for extractive ends. And then there is the human imagination, the folkloric current that gives the ribbon its name in local memory, the Road of Whispers. Elders tell of a path that guided the favored and misled the greedy, of a way whose stones remembered the dead of voices and whose dust swallowed those who tried to cheat its etiquette. Such mythic overlays matter because they encode social norms about mobility, who may pass, when, and under what terms, in story form that outlives administrative records. Sensational stories have also attached themselves to the ribbon, as they do to so many spectacular finds. Tales of caravans that found the route lit by strange lights at night, or of tombs discovered at its side containing men of impossible stature. We must balance appetite for the sensational with the discipline of method. Osteological claims, like all physical claims, require rigorous measurement and reproducibility. Yet myths themselves can be instructive. They tell us how later generations understood and remembered movement, danger, and reciprocity on that corridor. Picture yourself walking this road at dusk, the wind carrying the faint smell of spices, the distant bell of a camel caravan, the hush of a community performing its nightly checks, the way the stars come out like ledger marks in a sky that, for many centuries, was the only map available. Imagine stopping at a node where a woman sharpens a blade and sells small ceramic beads while an old man tells a listener the story of a traveler who tried to cheat the road and vanished. A cautionary tale encoding norms about honesty and communal responsibility. We still don't know, in the final analysis, whether the ribbon was primarily an instrument of statecraft, a communal lifeline, a ceremonial stage, or some productive combination of all three. What matters for us now is the conceptual reorientation it forces. The Sahara is not merely an obstacle to be crossed by others, it is a landscape with its own infrastructural history, a human-engineered environment that organized travel, trade, and social life across great distances. The road teaches a practical lesson in the archaeology of mobility. Networks are built by many hands and sustained by a mixture of coercion, ritual, collaboration, and ingenious adaptation to local ecologies. It also asks a more reflective question about how we think of connectivity in human history. Are corridors only the products of large states and empires? Or can they be the accumulated work of small communities whose coordinated actions amount, over the long run, to regional integration? If you stand in the imagined center of one of the ribbon's nodes and let the dust pull at your shoes, you feel the answer in your feet. Integration is often a bottom-up achievement, made possible by everyday acts of cooperation. The ribbon, in other words, is as moral a structure as it is material, a testament to human capacities to create systems of mutual dependence across what feels, to a single human lifespan, an unforgiving landscape. A scatter of perfect circles appears on the satellite images like the haloed impressions of ancient gatherings, concentric rings cut into the earth with a deliberateness that makes you pause, one sentence to hold in your hand. These are ceremonial centers, not accidents, their geometry speaking of ritual intent and astronomical knowledge. The circles vary in scale from intimate 20-meter diameters to monumental arenas approaching 100 meters across, their concentric banks and inward-facing terraces often aligned to solar and lunar events. Archaeologists measuring the axes have noted recurrent alignments toward the heliacal rising of Sirius and toward the azimuth of the winter solstice sunrise, suggesting that the builders were marking time and sky as carefully as they shaped stone and soil. When we place them in time, many date to the first millennium BC through the first few centuries CE, a period already dense with human mobility, with changing rainfall patterns and with the emergence of interregional networks across North and West Africa, though there are older outliers that hint at an even deeper ceremonial continuity whose roots may reach back into the late Holocene humid phase. At ground level, the evidence grows both poetic and precise. Burnt sacrificial pits with hearthstones heated to measurable temperatures, caches of worked bone laid in radial patterns, shell beads whose species point to marine sources hundreds of kilometers away, and small altars surfaced with a tar-like sealing compound that preserved organic residues long enough for us to know which animal species were chosen for offerings. The stratigraphy in several rings reveals episodic use, occupation layers separated by sterile lens deposits, which suggests these places were not continuously inhabited but were repeatedly activated on a seasonal or cyclical schedule, perhaps for rites of passage, calendrical observances, or consolidated feasting events that coincided with caravan arrivals. When you read the artifacts together, they suggest a ritual economy as sophisticated as any market economy, standard gifts, repeatable depositional practices, and portable paraphernalia that traveled with people across the landscape to be ritually deployed at known centers. Key discoveries include a cache of carved bone plaques bearing repeating geometric motifs, a motif that appears, frustratingly, also on ceramics recovered from nodes along the Great Ribbon, and a partially preserved wooden totem whose dendrochronology provided a narrow date window, anchoring one of the largest rings to around 250 BC with surprising precision. That totem, when analyzed for resins and pigments, yielded traces of substances that could have been used as incense or lubricants for ritual implements, a microscopic fingerprint of sensory practice that brings the ceremony back to human hands and noses. The debates that swirl around these rings are rich and stubborn. One camp argues these are community amphitheaters, designed to hold large congregations for public drama, lawmaking, and reciprocal exchange. The repeating architecture, the presence of central hearths, and the distribution of domestic refuse in peripheral zones support the idea of frequent communal gathering where social bonds were renewed. Another view emphasizes the astronomical alignments and proposes priestly observatories, built sites where calendar keepers read the skies to regulate planting, pilgrimage, and trade timetables, roles that would confer both sacred authority and practical power. A third, more speculative theory embraces the idea of a ritual landscape coded into networks of memory. Each ring acts as a mnemonic node in a map of place knowledge, used to transmit oral histories across generations and across distances. The rings are then less about spectacle and more about pedagogy, where elders taught youth the stories they would carry as they moved. But here's where it gets tricky. The material record supports elements of all these interpretations. The presence of domestic refuse around many rings undermines a pure, elite-controlled observatory model. Yet the care and layout, and the investments in durable materials, stone paving in some inner circles, sealed pits in others, suggest more than occasional use. Moreover, isotopic analysis of human remains associated with a few burial deposits inside peripheral terraces reveals dietary differences between those interred near the center and those on the margins, hinting at social differentiation during ritual events that could have ritualized hierarchy rather than obliterated it. Myth and spectacle stick to these places like dust. Oral traditions from desert communities speak of the circles of listening, sites where elders claim the earth remembers names and where certain stones are said to hum when the wind hits them at the correct angle. Legends assert that the circles marked points where the world was thin between the living and the dead, where lost tribes once gathered to renew covenants with the ancestors. Tabloid retellings exaggerate, of course. Stories circulate, unverified and delicious, about gigantic human footprints embedded in ring pavements, about chambers that hold skeletons of oversized proportions, and about cursed stones that inflict dreams of wandering on anyone who moves them. There are even modern accounts of visitors experiencing inexplicable light phenomena at night, tales that attract both religious pilgrims and paranormal seekers. We must be careful. Such accounts are not data in the scientific sense, but they do constitute a layer of human reaction that tells us how these landscapes have been woven into memory and identity. The mythic elements are not mere distractions. They are interpretive signals that these places mattered deeply to later communities, and that they were charged with meaning beyond the purely material. If you stand, imagine for a moment, in the center of one ring at twilight, the air still warm from a day of sun, and the first bright star pricks the dark, you can sense why groups would come here to mark the passage of seasons. The spatial acoustics amplify small sounds into a communal whisper. A single drumbeat seems to separate into echoes that can be counted like beads. The horizon frames the rising of a guiding celestial body that stitches local time to wider cosmologies. Still, for all the evocative elements, there remain stubborn unknowns that push scholars into productive humility. We still do not know the specific ritually prescribed sequences that played out within each ring. Were certain songs always sung, certain animals always offered, certain bodies ritually anointed? The archaeological residue captures the what, but rarely the how. We still do not know whether the rings functioned largely as regional meeting places that rotated seasonally between different groups, or whether certain circles held exclusive ties to particular lineages or clans who controlled ritual knowledge and access. Furthermore, the presence of marine shells raises logistical puzzles. Were these shells the high-value objects of distant trade, the residue of pilgrim offerings brought from coastal homes, or the detritus of wider exchange systems that embedded symbolic elements from many ecologies into local ritual packages? And then there is a final, more unsettling uncertainty. To what degree have later cultural practices altered the archaeological signature, selectively preserving some behaviors while erasing others, so that our reconstructions will always be partial, shot through with absence? Picture yourself in a ring when an elder lifts a beaded necklace and tells a child that their ancestor danced here when the moon was full. It is both a living practice and an archival act. the living memory fills lacunae where soil samples silence them. In the end, the reflective insight these circles press upon us is both modest and profound. Ritual is not fluff on the side of economic life, it is integral to social reproduction. The rings are evidence that people stitch their lives not just by producing food and moving goods but by making collective meaning in marked spaces. The geometry of the circles, their orientations to sky events, and their material investments tell a story of people who negotiated time and cosmos as carefully as they negotiated water and grain. The mythic overlays, the ghosts of lost tribes, the rumor of giants, the hush about cursed stones, are part of that negotiation, the narrative apparatus through which communities preserved rules, cautions, and identities. Still, for all the evidence, we must hold the shape of the question open, because the archaeological record stubbornly refuses finality. We still don't know whether each circle served a single purpose throughout its life or whether its function shifted across centuries in response to economic, environmental, or political pressures. All of these discoveries, the ordered grid like a city hiding its face under the sand, the long ribbon of movement stitching distant communities together, the concentric ceremonial rings that marked sky and obligation, the subterranean chambers that held the dead and perhaps the secrets of power, the lost waterways that once fed fields and people, and the humble storage pits that kept 1,000 small lives moving, when set beside one another, begin to sing in a single, complicated chord. What emerges is not a tidy historical narrative but a textured human landscape in which technology, ritual, mobility, memory, and environment braided themselves into lives both ordinary and ambitious. Taken together, the sites force us to rewrite a geography of expectation. The Sahara was not an empty negative space waiting to be crossed, but a layered world in which people built, bargained, performed, and buried their dead with as much deliberation as those who settled by great rivers. They shaped water, they measured stars, they cut stone and set timber, they moved goods along planned corridors and left tiny, distributed caches that, in aggregate, tell of organized logistics. They also sang songs, offered sacrifices, taught children under marked skies, and sometimes sealed their secrets where only the patient hand of erosion would reveal them to distant, mechanical eyes. The interpretive richness of this archive is its strength and its humility. It resists single-cause stories. Climate change mattered. There are clear signs that shifting rainfall regimes created windows of opportunity and windows of collapse. But climate alone does not explain persistence and innovation under marginal conditions. Trade networks mattered. The chemical fingerprints of amphorae and beads show long-distance connections. But neither do trade nor exchange alone account for the civic investments in cisterns and plazas. Power and hierarchy mattered too, as the variation in burials and monumental architecture suggests, yet social cohesion and ritual practice were equally essential in binding communities together across space. In short, these places are the product of multiple overlapping practices: engineering and imagination, commerce and ceremony, mobility and rootedness. They invite us to see the past as a system, an ecology of human choices played out against shifting climatic backdrops, not as a simple march from barbarism to civilization along a single axis. This lesson has urgent reverberations for our present. We, who are used to thinking of infrastructure as modern highways and internet backbones, may find humility in the fact that ancient people engineered movement across what we now call wasteland with a kind of local genius. They read groundwater by feel and memory. They kept caches where none of our talking maps would have guessed. They aligned ritual centers to the sun so that social time matched agricultural time. They borrowed metallurgy and motifs as easily as we borrow software libraries, blending local forms into something new. The past here is neither quaint nor exotic. It is strikingly familiar. It shows how human societies negotiate scarcity and abundance not just by technology but by social configurations, how trust, ritual, and small acts of cooperation accumulate into regional integration. Where modern planners might erect a dam or build a highway, ancient communities invested in wells, in repeated communal maintenance of way stations, in the repetitive choreography of seasonal gatherings that made exchange possible. Those are low-tech, high social cost investments, and their archaeological shadows are visible from space. Yet emotion, too, is part of the story. When we stand at the threshold of a subterranean chamber or run our hand along a wind-polished stone in a ring, we are touching human time in a way that rewrites our scale of empathy. The graves and the storage pits speak of peoples who hoped their acts would matter beyond a single life. The amphora fragments, the beads, the burnt offerings are not inert objects but echoes of hands, of hungry mouths, of bargaining voices, of lullabies and admonitions. The mythic overlay, stories of giants, of cursed stones that ask for respect, of roads that whisper truth to the honest and mislead the greedy, are not merely flights of fancy. They are mechanisms of cultural memory and moral coding, ways of encoding social rules into narratives so that future generations would remember the cost of greed and the reward of cooperation. Even if the more sensational claims prove false under scrutiny, the stories themselves are part of the archaeological evidence. They tell us how later peoples interacted with ruins, how they made sense of the past and turned landscapes into moral texts. That afterlife of ruins, the way stones become stories, is a crucial chapter in the human record. We must also reckon with the limits of our tools and the humility those limits demand. Satellite imagery is a powerful eye in the sky, but it is only an eye. It gives contours and prompts but not breath. Excavation gives breath back to the dried bones, but it is an invasive, finite act. Between satellite signatures and the decision to dig sits a responsibility. To communities who live now where those ruins rest, to descendant groups with claims of memory and meaning, to the scientific method that demands rigor and replicability, and to the broader public whose narratives and imaginations will be shaped by what is found and how it is presented. Ethical archaeology means listening to local voices, sharing findings in transparent ways, and resisting the temptation to turn every anomalous measurement into sensational copy. It also means acknowledging the possibility of being wrong and the provisionality of many of our best claims. At the same time, we must not let methodological caution become paralysis. The Earth will not interpret itself without effort. The work of integrating paleoenvironmental studies, osteological analysis, isotopic work, and careful, community-engaged excavation is the only plausible route to move from speculation to confident narrative. Even then, full certainty will be rare, ambiguity will likely be the norm, and in that ambiguity lies our honest human task, to hold multiple lines of evidence in conversation and to allow the story to remain open when it must. So why does any of this matter beyond fields and museum galleries? Partly because these sites recast the Sahara as a player in the longue durée of human history rather than as merely a stage for others' movements. They remind us that innovation, sophistication, and cultural complexity have many ecological homes. Recognizing that truth widens our stories about human resilience and creativity. It challenges pernicious narratives that equate marginal environments with marginal people. More than that, these discoveries connect us emotionally to a deep human continuum. The ancients who carved cisterns and planned plazas were not archetypes in a textbook but people who faced choices like ours. How to manage limited water, how to nourish children, how to trade across distances, how to memorialize loved ones, how to bind communities through ritual. Their solutions were imperfect, adaptive, and often temporary, much like our own. There is a kinship there that undercuts the arrogance of assuming that technological progress is only unidirectional. Instead, innovation is distributed and recurrent, often reinvented in waves across landscapes and ages. And so we arrive at the final, and perhaps most important, reflection. Archaeology is a practice of listening. The land under the Sahara has been speaking in forms we are only just learning to hear, in shadow lines at dusk, in chemical signatures of ancient clays, in the geometry of buried courtyards. Satellites gave us a first, impartial glance. Careful fieldwork will teach us how to hear the sentences beneath the dunes. But we should also listen with imagination, for imagination is the human faculty that translates measurement into meaning. To imagine someone sitting in a shaded courtyard counting out beads of glass, to imagine a procession circling a ring as the winter sun rose, to imagine a caravan stopping at a node to swap news and grain. These are not flights of fancy but acts of empathetic reconstruction that make the past legible in human terms. When we combine the rigor of science with the generosity of imagination, the result is a story that is at once credible and deeply moving. Keep digging, Some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.